dangerous. Mass pressure was the precondition. Lobbying was the mechanism of conversion. That sequencing is precisely what the government's model disrupts. If you weaken mobilization, you weaken the leverage lobbying depends on. And this brings me to my second argument, that is, social media is infrastructure for power building. The government will attempt to trivialize social media as hashtags and trends. That is fundamentally mistaken. Social media is a political infrastructure. It is how movements coordinate geographically dispersed communities, register voters, raise funds, and shape national narratives. Movements associated with the Black Lives Matter did not merely raise awareness. They mobilized millions of voters and influenced electoral outcomes in 2020. That changed who actually sat in legislative seats. That is structural political power. Shifting resources away from digital mobilization means trading the power to influence who hold the office for the weaker power of persuading those already in office. That is not strategic efficiency. That is political self sabotage. And in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, the clash in this debate is simple. The government proposes a zero sum trade off, weekend mobilization to fund lobbying. We propose a sequential model and a dual policy framework. Mobilization builds leverage, lobbying channels that leverage into law. If you drain the reservoir, the pipeline runs dry. Reparations will not be secured by whispering behind closed doors. It will be secured when public mobilization makes justice politically unavoidable. You cannot skip the stage that creates power and expect to wield it effectively. For those reasons, we proudly oppose. The opposition rests momentarily.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for that speech, opposition leader. And with that, we move to the first segment of cross-examination. As I explained before, in this segment, the opposition gets to ask three questions of the proposition, followed by the proposition posing their three questions to the opposition. All right, so let us get started. At this time, I invite Munro College to pose their three questions to Hillview College.
Our first question is, if social media advocacy is reduced, what mechanism creates electoral pressure that gives lobbyists bargaining power?
So social media funded by the government is reduced, but that doesn't diminish the voices of the people. Social media advocacy and activism can still be done by the people, and for free by that matter. Anybody can go onto social media and allow these and support these motions and raise awareness and raise their voices. It doesn't diminish any of the political, of the citizens' voices and choices.
Okay. Our second question is, what evidence demonstrates that behind the scenes lobbying is currently underfunded relative to its effectiveness?
Could you repeat the question? Thank you.
What evidence demonstrates that behind the scenes lobbying is currently underfunded relative to its effectiveness?
We are not saying that it is underfunded. We are saying that if it is, that it is the more sure bet that will guarantee policy change, that it should be prioritized. And as we could see, it is a fundamental step in the process of getting reparations. So why not prioritize it as a sure bet to receive what we are owed?
Okay. Our third question is, can you identify a successful reparations related policy that was achieved primarily through private lobbying without sustained public mobilization?
Yes, actually we can. The Holocaust, actually, there's much proof that shows that in, I'm not sure of the year, but Germany had paid, I believe it was Israel, paid them reparations. It was in the form of land and money. I believe it was billions of dollars they paid, and that was achieved through private negotiations, as they didn't even have social media at the time.
Additionally, in places like Japan, they received reparations after World War II, and that was before the era of social media. That was before that all began. So it was really due to private conversations and the pressure that public would have put on, but privately, not government funded.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Munro College, for those questions. Thank you, Hillview College, for those responses. Hillview College, you're now able to ask your 3 questions to Munro College.
Okay. Can you name a major financial transfer between governments that was initiated and secured primarily through social media activism rather than formal negotiation? And was it for reparations?
No, we cannot. However, social media advocacy is the building block that pushes the government to make legislative decisions and policies for reparations. It is the public pressure that forces those government bodies to make decisions.
Okay, so my next question would be then, what are the next steps to be taken if or when foreign governments ignore or even silence content related to reparations?
Then the,
Sorry, continue.
then the people of that society would vote out that government, because when the government is put under pressure, the people, when the people want a government that will listen to what they have to say.
I would quite agree. Final question. My final question would be: can you give an example of how a country choosing another government or voting out their government because they didn't decide that they want to choose reparations?
Well, an example is the 2020 elections with Joe Biden and Donald Trump, where Joe Biden, he led with racial equity, police reform, and strategic racism, systematic racism, where Donald Trump positioned himself as the law and order candidate, criticizing protest and unrest in relations to the George Floyd incident.
Thank you very much to both teams for that segment of cross-examination. We move on now with the presentation from the Deputy Prime Minister. Of course, the Deputy Prime Minister hails from Hillview College. Let us make them welcome. Hear, hear. Hillview College?
Apologies. You hear me well?
Yes, we are hearing you well.
Very much. Good afternoon, everyone. All protocols observed. The core of our case today is very simple. Governments using their limited resources for social media advocacy for reparations is a performative distraction. It is an expensive black hole for taxpayer funds that allows the state to look like it's making progress when in reality, the debt remains unpaid. We must hence shift these resources away from social media advocacy to political lobbying and diplomatic negotiation. As a government, our mandate should not be to trend online, but to legislate. My opponents today have proposed a dual policy, but this is completely unrealistic for small island states. With limited fiscal space, as noted by the International Monetary Fund, they cannot effectively fund both sustained influencer campaigns and professional diplomatic lobbying without weakening both. And wouldn't you rather a stronger bet as opposed to having both, but not having them at a strong ability? Now, let me break down some of the words in this topic because they are kind of tricky. Now, when you hear that last line, behind the scenes political lobbying, to many it paints a picture of corruption and dishonesty, even illegality. Now, despite what my opposition might say, this is a fallacy. Let's start with political lobbying. This is Simply put, structured, strategic persuasion of decision makers that works through hiring international lawyers, drafting policies, quietly building coalitions between other governments, and most importantly, face to face meetings with ambassadors and diplomats. And this practice is not rare, this is done globally because it is so successful, because it produces tangible policy outcomes. It's structured, it's methodical, and yes, like everything else in the world, unfortunately, it costs money. Which is why we must shift these resources from social media, as lobbying is not cheap. But it's not cheap for a reason, and that being that it is our best chance at getting reparations, even despite global resistance. We see this in our own region, in which the CARICOM Reparations Commission advanced its own 10-point plan through legal scholarship, commission research, and diplomatic engagement. With governments such as the UK, Netherlands, and France, this was done with political lobbying. These were done with private conversations. Yes, there was use of social media, but the matter still stands. Private lobbying was the majority of how it was done. This lobbying does not operate online, but in private discussions, which leads me to the phrase that the opposition would like you to fear today: behind the scenes. Behind the scenes doesn't mean private, it doesn't mean that you're hiding things. It means that it is non public engagement conducted through diplomatic channels, legal consultation, or elite negotiation forums. The United Nations Diplomatic Handbook recognizes quiet diplomacy as confidential negotiations conducted outside of media scrutiny. And this media scrutiny can make or break a negotiation as delicate as reparations. Privacy is crucial in maintaining the integrity of the negotiation. Behind a closed door is not where corruption occurs, but where formalities are dropped, financial figures are negotiated, and potential compromises can occur without that media interference. And I'm mentioning media interference a lot because it really is a serious threat to reparations discussions. So while a dual policy might work in an idealistic world, in reality, you cannot have both without how do I say, ruffling some feathers, to put it nicely. When Prime Minister, this is seen when Prime Minister Keir Starmer publicly stated that the United Kingdom would not be paying reparations or even issuing an apology. And that declaration was made in a politically charged public environment. Public pressure did not produce concession in that sense, in that scenario. It produced resistance. So I must ask, what does this pressure from social media, really achieve with respect to reparations? Now, when you drag delicate negotiations out of private rooms and onto public timelines, you don't increase leverage, as the opposition has stated, you increase hostility. And maybe, again, in an ideal world, when you publicly call out someone who has wronged you and you ask them for retribution, you're greeted with hugs or apologies or gifts or kisses. However, we do not live in that world. You are greeted in this world if you ask for reparations, if you ask for what you deserve, you are met with serious, serious consequences. Social media is a fire that you just can't put out, and it will only keep growing. This is seen by reputational risk, which is a danger that we face if we continue to pursue, or if we pursue, a joint measure. States may be perceived as confrontational or even weak in digital diplomacy, and that may result in reduced confidence among investors and international partners. This all leads to further economic decline, which, when the end goal of this entire conversation was to grow our economies with reparations, further proving that the use of social media advocacy can be counterproductive to the main goal. Again, a dual policy would work very well in an ideal world. We are not discrediting that fact by any means. However, we do not live in that world. This is why, when negotiating with larger economies, preserving diplomatic relationships is essential. Quiet diplomacy allows the other side to concede without having to appear weak to their domestic audience. And unfortunately, as the vulnerable countries that we are at the position where we must grovel and we must, how we say that? We have to bend to their will. Social media can raise awareness, and lobbying can secure results. In theory, both can work. But for most Caribbean states, resources are limited. They cannot afford to do both effectively. And in conclusion, we should shift resources to political lobbying, with its strategic behind the scenes negotiations offering us the best chance of real outcomes in the future. Thank you.
We thank you so very much for that presentation, Deputy Prime Minister rather. We now call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition from Munro College to present their speech. Hear, hear. Munro College, we invite now your deputy leader of the opposition to present their speech.
Sorry about that. The first speaker on our bench made a central claim. Mobilization creates power, lobbying converts it. My role is to prove why that is not merely persuasive rhetoric, but rather structural political reality. I will therefore do three things. Illustrate that the durable justice movement has followed this sequence of mobilization before negotiation. Additionally, I will demonstrate how shifting resources structurally weakens leverage over time. And finally, I will delve further into the dual policy framework. Firstly, durable change has always been movement driven. It is unequivocal that the government is trying to persuade you that the policy is born in a quiet committee room. But what is not evident to them, rather to us and history, is that policy follows pressure. I will reiterate the Civil Rights Act of 1964 just to prove our point with a deeper analysis. It was not elite goodwill that made it pass. It was Birmingham. It was Selma. Moreover, this legislation did not emerge because lawmakers suddenly discovered moral clarity in private meetings. It followed years of sustained grassroots mobilization in Birmingham in 1963. Peaceful protesters, including school children, were met with police dogs and fire hoses. The images were broadcasted across the United States and across the world. Public opinion shifted, international embarrassment mounted. Political leaders realized that maintaining segregation now carried a greater political cost than dismantling it. Then came the March on Washington, where over 250,000 people gathered publicly to demand civil and economic rights. This was not symbolic theater, it was demonstration of scale. It showed legislators that this was not a fringe issue, but it was a national constituency. Only after the escalation of public pressure did congressional negotiations gain traction. The private negotiations did not create urgency, they responded to it. Without Birmingham, without Selma, without visible mobilization, the bill would likely have stalled indefinitely in committee. Madam Mr. Speaker, even in more contemporary contexts, movements associated with Black Lives Matter illustrate how digital mobilization alters institutional realities. Following the killing of George Floyd in 2020, mass protests erupted globally. These protests translated into measurable electoral shifts, increased voter turnout, changes in primary races, and altered campaign platforms. Candidates adjusted their positions on policing and racial justice, not because lobbyists whispered persuasively, but because millions of people demonstrated publicly that these issues would influence votes. The negotiation stage is real, it is important, but it is reactive, not generative. This is why the government's proposal is structurally flawed. By shifting resources away from mobilization, they weaken the very mechanism that creates urgency. They attempt to prioritize the conversion process while undermining the power that must first exist to be converted. History does not support that model. Political change has never flowed from silence outward, it has always flowed from visible pressure inward. Second, shifting roles weakens leverage over time. Mr. Speaker, what the opposition realizes is that the side government has framed this as efficiency focused on so-called decision makers. However, they should not be cognizant that power is not static. It must be maintained continuously. Therefore, if resources are supposed to be shifted, then public awareness declines to an all-time high, media attention fades, diaspora coordination weakens, and electoral salience drops. What remains is a lack of accountability and transparency, a loss of power, from media constituency, and when electoral salience drops, legislators deprioritize the issue. This creates a vicious cycle. Less mobilization, less pressure, less legislative urgency, fewer wins, declining public enthusiasm. The government's model risks long-term stagnation for short-term insider access. By contrast, our dual policy framework sustains that power pipeline. Mobilization replenishes leverage, lobbying converts it. Wins reinforce mobilization. That is a virtuous cycle. Mr. Speaker, our dual policy framework is not big corporation, it is structured integration. It ensures that social media advocacy and behind the scenes lobbying operate in coordination, not competition. It has three core components. First, a power building arm. Second, a policy conversion arm. But what makes our model superior is the third component, a strategic coordination mechanism. This ensures that mobilization campaigns align with legislative strategies and that negotiations remain accountable to the communities they represent. In conclusion, this debate ultimately turns on one fundamental question: where does political power come from? The government assumes that power resides primarily in committee, rooms, and private negotiations. They therefore prioritize shifting resources toward those spaces. We have demonstrated that this misunderstands how change actually occurs.
Thank you
Power is
very
not
much. Thank you very much, Deputy Leader of the Opposition. You are out of time. All right, so we continue now with the second segment of cross examination. In this segment, we're going to invite the proposition team, that's Team Hillview College, to pose their three questions first to the opposition team, followed by the opposition team doing likewise. All right, so Hillview College, you may now ask your three questions.
The first question I have for y'all is, how do you realistically expect our government to support this dual policy framework with a struggling nation with limited funds?
I'm
Okay.
sorry, we have some technical issues. So could you please repeat the question if you had already asked?
Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. How do you realistically expect our government to support this dual policy framework in a struggling nation with limited funds?
Okay, so yes, we do have limited resources as a small nation, but it is because of those limited resources why we need all hands on deck. We need as much leverage as we can get from social media.
Our second question would be, given the relative size of Caribbean media reach compared to major Western media ecosystems, how realistically does your campaign shift enough foreign voters to influence in legislative outcomes?
So these are focused when the government is put under pressure, they will be more likely to implement policies to address the issues of reparations.
Thank you. Um, my final question will be, if we have to fall back on political lobbying after the fact, why couldn't we have just invested more into the more secure option when the end goal is securing reparations and not just spreading awareness?
Can you please repeat that question?
No problem. If we have to fall back on political lobbying after the fact, why couldn't we have just invested more into the secure option when the end goal is securing reparations and not just spreading awareness?
Because starting with um lobbying won't have the leverage that we gain from social media advocacy. That's why we build leverage first, then lobbying later. It is sequential.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so
Go ahead.
our first question is, without the social pressure of the public, how can you be certain that the government will address a controversial issue such as reparations and implement feasible policies?
Sorry, can you repeat? Sorry.
Okay. Without the social pressure of the public, how can you be certain that the government will address a controversial issue such as reparations and implement feasible policies?
So our stance is that we do not negate the effort and the impact of social pressure, but we are saying that this is not something that needs to be government funded, meaning that we can shift the resources into something that our government should do. We are not meant to be the influencer that brings about change. That is what the people should do. By education, then they can rise up, and then we will have grassroots movements where they will stand up for themselves and have their voice be heard. But with that, we have on our side as the government our duty to be the negotiator and then to bring about change through political lobbying.
Okay. Our second question is, why is shifting resources superior to a sequential model where mobilization builds leverage and lobbying converts it?
To answer that question, I think you have to look at the countries that require reparations the most, and you also have to look at just money but time and manpower. It's not fair and it's not effective.
Okay. And our final question is, if decisions occur behind closed doors, what safeguards prevent elite capture or misrepresentation of public interests?
Excuse, can you repeat? You kind of broke up on our end. Can you repeat?
Problem. So if decisions occur behind closed doors, what safeguards prevent elite capture or misrepresentation of public interests?
Okay, so a good distinguishment that we would like to make in this is the difference between behind the scenes and being corrupt or being not transparent. Like you could let your public and your citizens know what you are negotiating towards and what the government would like to achieve. And we could go along with the citizens' goal and the citizens' peace of mind without go ahead.
Yeah, and not to mention that if you give government a social media platform, what's to say that the government is not going to use that social media platform to pursue their own agenda? You know?
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks to both teams for an enlightening section of cross-examination. We are now going to pause for 1 minute. And at the other end of the 1 minute pause, we will hear the reply speeches from the opposition team first, followed by that from the opposition team. Your 1 minute pause begins now. Nevertheless, we want to thank both teams for the interest in the attention, clearing, and the joy of the work coming through. All right, I think we need a 1 minute break. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think our 1 minute pause has ended, and so it is now time for us to resume. At this time, I invite the third speaker, the reply speaker from Munro College, representing the opposition's case, to present their final submission, the team's final submission in this debate. Munro College, we welcome
Mr.
you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Speaker, the perspective is contradicted by the side proposition. They seem to have a very minimalistic understanding regarding the essence of both action plans to fulfill one aim, reparations. To finalize the concretization of our stance as side opposition, I will reinstate the opposition stance, create the clash, summarize pivotal points made by my team members, provide more examples, and elucidate why we would have won this match. First and foremost, I must reaffirm that the team stance is not for us to plummet one strategy. It is to create leverage. The leverage that is already interdependent and interchangeable with social media advocacy and behind the scenes political lobbying, which would ultimately attain the objective of ascertaining reparations. What seems shocking, though, to side proposition, that we would have completely opposed and say no, we are shifting resources from behind the scenes political lobbying and reallocating them to social media advocacy. Instead, we suppress this idea, since the motion did not say we should prioritize one over the other, rather to shift resources from one to another, which we stand completely against. Mr. Speaker, we understand and look beyond the scope of side propositions lenses, that we know for sure both social media advocacy and behind the scenes political lobbying, and hence the very essence of not eroding the fabric of one to fulfill the other. Therefore, the side proposition took it as this and not what we thought of it, creating a separation between social media advocacy and behind the scenes political lobbying, as opposed to using them in tandem with each other. The call for privacy for such a sensitive topic, when the ones who will be most affected are the people. The people must know the laws that will affect them. Mr. Speaker, we are aware social media didn't exist years ago, but that doesn't account for now. What existed, however, was a traditional media advocacy, which still shapes reparation, as mentioned in the first and second speakers' speeches, regarding the brutality that was televised for people to be aware and be part of a movement. Even then, those resources were not shifted to please behind the scenes political lobbying. So why would we now persist in doing that? Mr. Speaker, the proposition has failed to concede to the fact that both can coexist without shifting resources from one to the other. However, I would like to reiterate the stance we took from our team. Our first speaker mentioned that lobbying is heavily reliant on leverage from constituencies, social media, surveillance, outlets, etc. Lobbying without public pressure as a form of support is absolutely useless. Moreover, my first speaker also mentioned that social media is, by extension, media for advocacy in this instance. Why would we slowly want to eradicate the effective existence of such a propellant for reparations rather than gather people to create movements? And finally, he stated that the essence of mobilization created by social media would very well be diminished, which we don't need since it would erode the relevance of having accountability and transparency. I must also mention that the second speaker posited that durable change has always been driven by consistent movements. It is therefore not logical for us to deliberately neglect and disregard the woven fabric of this that propels lobbyist groups. The shifting of resources from social media advocacy to behind the scenes political lobbying inherently weakens the leverage and support of social media gradually, which we need to strengthen the effectiveness of lobbyist groups for us to gain reparations. My second speaker also provided a deeper analysis of the dual policy framework, which would have helped establish our core foundation and premises of this argument. If two strategies can coexist to effectively achieve the aim of reparations, there's absolutely no need to restrain resources by shifting one parameter to strengthen the other. Mr. Speaker, I would like to provide more examples to further prove and consolidate our stance. The Center for Reparation Research is one example that is in line with CARICOM's reparative justice program. It provides online advocacy through social media platforms by engaging people, especially young people, to be engaged in online activism by debating and advocating, thus gaining knowledge about reparation through social media. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, we the opposition refute this proposal and present our synergistic alternative, the dual policy framework, not because we want to oppose for opposing's sake, but because it has also been shown by research that this is the logical strategy to use rather than solely plummeting one parameter to fulfill the other. Mr. Speaker, yes, as small countries, we may have limited resources, but because of those limited resources, we need powerful leverage from social media advocacy. Side proposition has no logical grounds to substantiate the reason we should not move in this direction and has therefore lost the moral capacity of understanding this debate. So we call on the proposition team to wholeheartedly rethink, then acknowledge and conform to our side of the debate, given our structured and balanced stance. Thank you. The opposition is.
Thank you very much, Opposition Reply Speaker, for concluding the case on behalf of your team so ably. And we move on now to the final speaker in our debate, the Proposition Reply Speaker. Of course, the Proposition Reply Speaker comes to us from Team Hillview College out of Trinidad and Tobago. And the speaker you've just heard hails from Munro College, based in Jamaica. All right, so we welcome at this time Hillview College's third speaker. Here.
All protocols observed. Honorable judges, the history of the Caribbean is a ledger that is soaked in blood and betrayal. For centuries, we were the engine of the European Empire, yet when our shackles finally broke, where did the fruits of our labor flow to? It did not go to the bruised backs of the liberated, it went into the pockets of the oppressors. £20 million. That was the amount paid to the planters for their loss, while out the property what the enslaved were left with nothing but the dirt beneath their fingernails and a debt that they never owed. Today, we stand at a crossroads of justice. We are owed approximately 24 trillion USD by the UK alone. The opposition wants us to take the taxpayers' hard-earned dollar and gamble it on an algorithm that prizes carnival music, white sand, and ocean waves over a crime against humanity. We at the Caribbean are already struggling to pierce the international internet border. Why prioritize placing resources into trying to make a viral trend or a 50-minute soundbite when it could go to areas that can actually pass the policy and changes? We, the proposition, wholeheartedly recognize the power that social media can have as a tool, but we must not confuse publicity with policy. Caribbean governments are already strapped for resources. We cannot justify spending it on a social media platform that the public can already use, all while neglecting the government channels that only a state can navigate. Anyone, anyone in the public can provide that outcry, but only a diplomat can provide that signature that enacts changes. Honorable judges, it seems that our proposition have forgotten that managing social media using tools and managing the teams need resources. It needs time. They talk about the lofty goals of a dual policy, but we can't even manage without a social media team in the first place. Where are we getting these funds from? The proposition's entire argument can be summarized in the fact that social media advocacy is good and we need public rallying. But why does it have to come from the government? Why can't it be from the people? The topic is study how shift resources from social media into political lobbying, and we think that the government should not be forced to invest into social media. The proposition talks about points about being a Black Lives Matter and the silent movement, but it has to be noted that these social media campaigns work because they are in from Western country, from the giant superpowers from America. Not to mention the fact that these movements were caused by the people, they were started by the people and not the government. The government did not fund any of these campaigns that were started by the people. Therefore, the opposition have further proven our point. Yes, the movement proved that people need to rise up and protest before the government. And not to mention that the US, the BLM protests caused legislation to be made, but it was the government, it was the Congress that had the resources that the US had to be made for the legislation to be passed. Sorry. Why should we risk our diplomatic ties on the altar of public shaming when we could be in the room where the checks are signed? Why would we use the public's money to fund a faceless government account when the people themselves are already the loudest voices online? We should let the people speak on the streets while let the government strike in the boardrooms. We do not want likes, we do not want retweets, we want reparations. Honorable judges, we are here to settle a reparation in which we are owed. True justice is not found in the fickle trends of our algorithm, but in the steady iron will resolve of our diplomats. We must move beyond the digital noise and into the quiet rooms where history is written and treaties are signed. For the sake of our ancestors who are sold and for the generations who are yet to be born, we must choose the substance of policy over the shadow of performance. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for your presentation and, of course, for concluding the debate overall. We are so fascinated by the arguments and look forward now to the opportunity to go and deliberate those behind closed doors. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will return shortly with the results. All right, thank you.
Your Honor, why we as former colonial bodies need to give them reparations.
Order! Prosecutor, plead your case.
Your Honor, we need reparations because we deserve them. The defendants are guilty of atrocious crimes, including indigenous genocide at an unfathomable scale, cultural erasure, and theft of our resources. And for what? To build their grand empires across the sea. This is why the question should not be whether or not we need reparations today. The question should be, why haven't we been given them sooner? Give me this.
Order! I've made my decision. I find the defendant guilty on all charges.
I'm Haley Ramra.
I'm John Chan.
I'm Shiva Bihari.
And I'm Seth Mohammed, team captain, and we thank you for your time.
We need reparations because slavery didn't just steal labor, it stole opportunity. For hundreds of years, our ancestors built wealth they never benefited from. And when slavery ended, they were left with nothing. The damage didn't just disappear. It passed down through generations. Reparations aren't about handouts or blame. They're simply about repair. They're about fixing the inequalities in education, health, and development that still exist today. If harm was inherited, then justice should and has to be inherited too.
The Center for Reparation Research is thrilled to launch this international reparation debate competition. This international reparation debate competition that we launched today for secondary schools is one of our most important projects. How do we engage youth on matters of reparatory justice? The change needed in the education system can only be advanced when the youth are engaged and their voices are heard.
Why is reparations so important in and for the Caribbean? Because time comes for justice for our ancestors. Time comes for the Caribbean to insist on the right to development, to be compensated for the violence against our ancestors. So outreach to the young people who have joined this movement is critical.
There is no mass movement that isn't a youth movement. And we certainly want reparations to be a mass movement. So it's really exciting, though, to have a regional stroke international debating competition. And I'm looking forward to your participation as you construct your arguments for and against, remembering that the 10-point plan for reparatory justice is our guiding framework for the areas in which we are demanding compensation, because we certainly want to impact the public opinion and awareness in Europe. So it's fantastic to have the United Kingdom participating as well.
So why is it important for youth to be involved in the reparation movement? Being involved in the reparations movement is critical to youth if one is to know their history so that they can understand why their societies are functioning as they are today. The future of the countries we live in are dependent on the current situation that exists today in our countries. And these current conditions were created by the past, including indigenous genocide, African enslavement, indentureship, and colonization. Being involved in reparations is about seeking justice, seeking a way to reduce inequalities in our own countries and then in the broader world. It's about seeking a more peaceful and balanced world, where global problems are solved in partnerships, not in isolation. I believe the sponsors are hoping this competition will allow our youth to gain knowledge about the past so that as young people, you'll be able to make better decisions in the future and make our countries better places.
We know that we need to understand stories about people that look like us. So the fact that so many of you young people have registered was so encouraged by your enthusiasm and your passion for wanting to enter this debate. It is so important. It's just at the core of who we are, that we need to understand where we come from, understand our true history, and having a debate competition on this particular topic is such an important milestone. To have a real conversation about repair, and the fact that our young people were so articulate with their presentations, and to ensure that we keep educating our young people, because you are the future of us and are the Caribbean's a sustainable future. So congratulations, everybody.
We are looking forward to the debate. Encourage everyone to join the debate. Thank you so much, all.
Education about the history of the oppression of a people can either be a tool for liberation or a tool for reinforcing trauma. What allows for education to be one or the other is not the topics taught, but how they are delivered. Therefore, we, the proposition, would like to firmly state that teaching the history of the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans, or TTEA for short, does significantly more harm than good, not because of the topic, but because of the current pedagogical approach taken. Your average high schooler learns about the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans through a rigid, standardized curriculum. They are taught by a teacher who is expected to simply deliver information, often in a lecture format, and test students on their ability to memorize facts, years, and names. In this setting, students are not invited to engage critically with the material, ask difficult questions, or relate the content to their own lived experiences. Instead, they passively receive a version of history unable to truly process its relevance, impact, or emotional weight. Where is the opportunity to understand how this horror shaped the blood in our veins and the names we carry? There is none. Students memorize facts and regurgitate them on paper. But inside, the lesson lingers, that the history of the African diaspora is one of subjugation, and that their place in the world is to suffer and survive, not to lead, not to thrive. This is exactly what Paulo Freire, in his work The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, described as the banking method of education, where students are treated as empty accounts to be filled by the teacher. Freire believed this model was fundamentally oppressive because it prevents learners from becoming active participants in their own liberation. It discourages dialogue, reflection, and consciousness raising. This is what he calls conscientization. The teaching of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans today in many classrooms still follows this harmful pattern. When this topic is taught in a banking method that assumes dichotomy between human beings and the world they live in, Freire says an individual is a spectator rather than a recreator. This kind of teaching doesn't empower, it conditions students to fit into a world shaped by oppression rather than resist it. And that is why we say it does more harm than good, because it teaches history in a way that keeps students passive, not engaged. We learn about Oladoye Ekiano, we learn his name, we learn that he experienced this and he wrote an account, but do we open the book and study it and analyze it and discuss it with our teachers the way that Israeli schools discuss Elie Wiesel's Night of the Holocaust? The opposition says they want students to learn about the slave trade and the enslavement of a people. And of course, we all want all students across the world to have reverence for this grave and absolutely horrific period of history. And we do this with the intention that learning about it can empower them to challenge the lingering legacies of racism and inequality. However, defending the status quo, which our opposition seeks to uphold and claims offers us more good than harm, will not offer us this. This is not remembrance. This is not reverence. And when you trace the system back to its roots, you realize that this is not our system at all. Accepted.
The fact that students today are not listening about the brutality, but also about the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies, creating empowerment more than harm.
Right. Our issue is not with these topics being taught, but it is the way that they are taught and the way that they are emphasized with regards to all of the other things that are occurring within African history. To continue, our education system was inherited from Britain, a colonial power that had no interest in nurturing Caribbean identity or liberation. And what good can we expect from teaching this topic when we are continuing to do so in England's pedagogical approach? Even worse, as you mentioned, African history is taught in the Americas and Europe as though it began with slavery. From primary school, students are introduced to African people not through the glory of their kingdoms, their intellectual traditions, or their achievements, but through their chains. Why is it so hard for you to name a single black figure whose legacy is not defined by resistance or white oppression? Why is it that we teach about Toussaint and Nani but not Imhotep, Mansa Musa, or Queen Nzinga in the same breath? This should be taught first. And compare this to how the Holocaust is taught in Israeli. This is taken from the Israeli Ministry of Education.
Point of information.
Declined. Children are introduced to the brilliance of their culture first, their thinkers, their faith, and their resilience before they are taught about genocide. Their oppression is contextualized within a legacy of strength, not as the first chapter. If that isn't a pedagogical problem, then what is? When slavery is taught primarily as a story of powerlessness and victimization, with the current banking method of pedagogy, it does more than inform. It deeply affects the psychological development of students, particularly those of the African diaspora. During adolescence, a critical time for identity formation, as described in Erickson's theory of psychosocial development, students are particularly vulnerable to internalizing messages about their race and their place in history. If the dominant narratives they encounter emphasize subjugation or this constant need to fight without also highlighting pre-colonial civilizations and agency, students may inherit a sense of trauma and inferiority. Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson's 1995 concept of stereotype threat shows that students underperform when they fear confirming negative stereotypes about their group, a common experience for Black students navigating a curriculum saturated with ancestral suffering. In classrooms where Black students only encounter these narratives and are rarely offered examples of greatness before colonial times, they are more likely to fear confirming negative stereotypes about Black intellectual inferiority. And yes, this study found that this did significantly reduce their academic performance. In contrast, we argue for emancipatory pedagogy, which views students as active co-creators of knowledge and encourages reflection, dialogue, and transformation. We want students to read and discuss the first accounts, and this should be a mandatory part of the curriculum, not an option. Additionally, students should be first met with pre-colonial history that showcases the richness and strength of Africans from various tribes and kingdoms before delving into the horrors of the slave trade. Through student-centered dialogic approaches, this topic becomes not a detached narrative of victimhood, but a pathway to critical consciousness where students develop an internal locus of control, a sense of pride, and the tools to challenge injustice. When classrooms prioritize empathy, voice, and critical inquiry over memorization, the teaching of the TTEA can become what Freire calls a practice of freedom, not oppression. We are fully justified in arguing that teaching the history of the TTEA causes more harm than good on the basis of the heavily flawed pedagogy. In parliamentary debate, motions like this are evaluated based on the status quo, meaning how things are actually occurring now. As such, the opposition cannot shift the debate by suggesting that in some ideal future it could be taught differently or argue on the basis of the principle. We are debating the present, and the burden is to defend the way that it is taught now. Thank you.
All protocols observed, the opposition remains resolute against the motion. This House believes that the teaching of the trafficking of enslaved Africans causes more harm than good. We in the opposition agree that there are flaws in the method, but we argue that even in its current form, teaching this history does far more good than harm. We accept the definitions posited by the opposition with the exception of the word harm. Harm caused by the teaching of the trafficking of enslaved Africans in this case is more like temporary discomfort that fosters long-term justice awareness and healing. The proposition burden is to prove that the act of teaching this history is inherently harmful, even when taught well, and that these harms are so deep and widespread that they outweigh all educational and social benefits. We must prove that the current approach generates more harm than good, and 2, the harm is not inherent to the method but as a result of poor implementation, and 3, that the teaching of enslaved Africans creates civic awareness, empathy, prevention of recurrence, and general social progress. The status quo, the history of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans is already being taught, but with growing care and impact. Students today are learning not just about the brutality, but also the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies of inequality. Yes, some schools get it wrong. Reform is being done for more inclusive, trauma-informed, and empowering education, making it the norm. Mr. Speaker, we are not for the current way of teaching this history. The motion didn't state the current way. We are for the best way of teaching this history. Allow me to rebut. And this best way is trauma-informed teaching. This would be training teachers to handle emotional topics with care, no graphic reenactment, use check-ins, and create safe spaces. This builds resilience instead of re-traumatizing students. And 2, balancing the story. Don't stop at brutality. Teach about African civilization, resistance leaders like Nani of the Marus, and achievements of the African diaspora that restores pride and identity. 3, we would center real voices, use first-hand accounts, African scholars, and cultural sources to humanize the content and shift away from cold textbook trauma, and link the past to the present, which will let students reflect through debate, which is already being done, and modern connections to racism and justice. This transforms discomfort into action and purpose, including Black educators. Involve Black voices in teaching is as authenticity, prevents tone deafness, and build trust in diverse classroom. This is credible as the RAN program has a similar approach, and it has proven to be working, as it has a 94% increase in the racial unity and empowerment. Allow me to rebut the misconceptions provided by the government. The government stated that teaching of trafficking of enslaved African causes discomfort and psychological harm. But let me say that discomfort is not harm, Mr. Speaker. And the 2019 UNESCO states that students taught slavery alongside resistance have greater empathy and understanding of justice. And secondly, discomfort is necessary for growth and historical reckoning, just like the Holocaust education or genocide studies. They also stated that the current method does not include the history before slavery. But Mr. Speaker, let me say that this is a big misconception. Most syllabi incorporates the history of the Africans before they were colonized. We don't learn about slavery before we learn about Mansa Musa. We don't learn about slavery before we learn about Songhai Empire. It is in the rationale also and syllabi that the teachers should use discussions to actually engage the students. In today's debate, I will bring 2 substantive. 1, the current methods build civic awareness, empathy, and critical thinking. And 2, discomfort from learning is not the same as harm. It leads to empowerment. My second speaker will discuss justice and the prevention of repetition in the injustice, while my third speaker will prove why we remain supreme. Our first substantive is the harm lies in the method, not the content. My first warrant is balanced teaching that includes stories of resistance and survival, reduces emotional harm, and builds empathy. When we emphasize both suffering and human dignity in the trafficking of enslaved Africans by teaching resistance, African agency, and survival, we shift from trauma to empowerment. It does more harm than good because it builds pride, resilience, and understanding. For example, the Holocaust education isn't taught by showing only images of death camps. They come with stories of resistance, survival, and moral courage. It fosters pride, empathy, and moral courage instead of guilt or division. That's why balanced, trauma-informed teaching benefits are supreme. My second warrant is effective, safe teaching already exists and work. We're seeing programs like Facing History and Ourselves offer concrete evidence that teaching hard history can be both emotionally and safe, intellectually enriching. According to a 2021 RAN Corporation study, students in these programs, which is a reform program by the way, show that 94% increase in civic agency, meaning they felt more empowered to take social action and reported deeper empathy, stronger historical understanding, and more open-minded attitude. And the fact that we're seeing this in real classroom, Mr. Speaker, proves that harm is not inherent to the topic. It's about how we design the curriculum and support teachers. And we are currently doing this now through reform. If we have models that work, and we do, then the moral burden shifts to improving delivery, not erasing the content. What my third warrant is suppressing this history causes more harm than good. Mr. Speaker, be aware that we're not talking just about the current history. We're talking about the teaching of the history overall, because that's what the mood says. In environments where slavery is ignored or downplayed, misinformation spreads like wildfire. Students grow up believing that slavery was minor, that racism is just a mere relic of the past, or that systemic inequality is simply an overreaction. This ignorance sustains real-world harm, and contrary to this, we're seeing that countries like Germany, who have faced their history head-on with regards to the Holocaust, show lower levels of historical denialism and far-right extremism than those that whitewash. The impact, it promotes social equity and activism, because when students learn this history accurately and empathetically, they become more socially aware, engaged, and ready to challenge injustice. And 2, it empowers empathetic, informed citizens who are empowered to fight modern injustice. And 3, it protects future generations from repeating injustice. My second substantive is silence enables racism to thrive. My first warrant is when schools avoid teaching slavery, they leave students with distorted or incomplete narratives. In the absence of formal education, when students are left to piece together understanding from biased media, peer opinions, or online misinformation, the result is a deeply distorted view of race and history. A 2018 SPLC report showed that only 8% of the US high school seniors could identify slavery as the primary cause of the Civil War. When students believe that slavery was a voluntary arrangement or that racism ended in 1865, it undermines every effort to promote justice and equality today. Silence gives racism plausible deniability that it suggests falsely that if we don't talk about injustice, it must not exist. The impact, it ensures future generations. And with that, the proposition momentarily rests.
400 years ago. 400 years ago, my people were dragged from their homes, tribes, families, placed on floating wood, and shipped across the Atlantic to what would be later described as the most inhumane act of all time. Cold, dark, uncomfortable, cannot describe the trip in ships where whips did not fail to miss. Injustice, rape and disgrace, blood rains, brute, force, ignorance, hate in their veins. Sweat and tears, labor revealed, produce from king fields only for the esteemed. 400 years of eroding one's pride, culture, heritage, value. 400 years of the iron chain, stringing up, leaving bare. Oh, but they never cared. Why fight when you would be met with sharp blades? So don't you dare cry out in fear. Why not plan an escape with the plat?
And gentlemen, welcome
Of
back.
ones here.
We are at the end.
Oh, the
Results are about to be released with respect to the outcome of this match. Of course, just to remind you, the match featured Hillview College in proposition out of Trinidad and Tobago, and of course, representing Jamaica, we had Munro College. And of course, the motion, the issue that was fiercely contested between both teams had to do with whether or not Caribbean governments should focus on social media campaigning and sort of mobilizing people through social media engagements versus it's sort of behind the scenes lobbying with, of course, those power brokers and those countries who are tasked or are expected actually to pay reparations. Before I get more into this announcement and this results segment, I want to do something that's a little unorthodox. I'm going to invite Ambassador Smith to really share some perspectives that he shared with us during the deliberations that I think are worth being heard by both teams. Ambassador Smith, the floor is yours. Do we have Ambassador Smith with us?
I am here.
Hi, Ambassador. Yes, go right ahead.
I apologize for that glitch. I wanted to be able to express to the debaters my heartfelt congratulations. I thought the teams were well matched. I was incredibly impressed as a high school debater myself and as a member of parliament in the Bahamas for a number of years. I got to involve myself for many decades in debate. From my high school memory, we never even came close to the quality that you produce today. I thought I was so impressed. And with regard to my time in Parliament, I recognize that if you were members of the government and members of opposition in a real parliamentary debate, I would have been impressed with the quality of your presentations. The passion was there, the research was there. Whether or no you agreed with the issue doesn't matter. The bottom line is you did the work to come, and you came prepared. You spoke with clarity. The quality of your voices was excellent, first rate, and your content was substantial and impressive. Each of you would be welcomed, I think, at any gathering of your compatriots in high school and in your communities to speak to this issue of reparations. And I hope you will do that and speak honestly, as you, unlike what you may have had to do for this debate, but speak honestly in that setting to what you really believe. Because remember, in this issue of reparations, it isn't a matter of right or wrong nationally. It is very much a matter of what each individual believes is the right thing to do. And so I thank you for the opportunity to have listened to you and learned from you, and I am grateful.
Thank you so very much, Ambassador Smith, and students. You recognize I needed to have done this most unorthodox thing. Exists in social media, but it also delegitimizes the effectiveness of the campaign, broadly speaking, for reparations, when it is that these governments, having employed social media campaign tactics to ultimately secure the serious consideration of their counterparts in Europe, the post-colonial, the former colonial states. They say that that is a major concern. Now, contrastingly, we hear from Munro College this idea that mobilizing people power is what we term it, the grassroots kind of activation to kind of apply broad-based pressure upon the states who have not yet paid reparations is going to be incredibly important. I think Munro College does well to prove this point. They do so concretely and comprehensively to the extent that Hillview College concedes that grassroots pressure is important. We think, though, that Munro College loses a bit of specific engagement on the motion at hand. The motion speaks to social media. And it is not, particularly in light of the argumentation we get from Hillview College that sort of undermines social media's effectiveness in driving comprehensive broad-based support for reparations, we are concerned as to whether or not Munro College has done enough to prove not just that grassroots mobilization and people power are important, which we can see they are, but is it going to be achieved through the vehicle of social media engagement? We're not convinced that Munro College does enough to prove that. To the extent as well that Munro College's examples like Selma and elsewhere where people would have risen up and demanded pressure from this movement and activate and sort of policy changes and systemic changes from the political directorate. Those kinds of people power movements, as was pointed out by Hillview College, were in fact initiated not through social media, but through grassroots mobilization. We're not sure that there's a meaningful distinction, but we're led to believe that in as much as there is a distinction to which Munro College does not respond to show that there is in fact sufficient similarity between both kinds of activations, we are led to believe that there may very well not be enough by virtue of those examples to prove the efficacy and the effectiveness of social media to achieve the ends that Munro College strives to achieve. That said, ladies and gentlemen, the scores are impressive. one team ends with 275 points as compared to the other team's 287 points. Impressive, those scores are. The winners of this match in the international reparations debate competition for 2026. This is the second round of this competition. The winners are, ladies and gentlemen, Hillview College, representing Trinidad and Tobago, standing in proposition of this motion. We invite both teams now to unmute their microphone and let us hear some of the excitement and the passions flowing.
Thank you so much. And honestly, it was very well played by Munro College. Trust me, during that cross-examination, we were, if you could have seen us, we were like, what do we say?
Yeah, we were.
But thank you to the judges. Thank you very much.
Yes, it was the same for us.
Go ahead, Munro.
It was a competition put up by you guys. Thank you.
Good. And of course, please, if you can find a way to get the ambassador's comments and compliments as a sort of an endorsement of your capacity, resoundingly so, you really should do that. You know, you should almost put this in your virtual portfolio, coming from as eminent a gentleman as Ambassador Smith. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have as well another decision to announce: the best debater in this match. Now, we had a little tussle as it relates to whether it should have been the first speaker from Hillview College or the third speaker from Hillview College. And we ultimately concluded that the best debater, by a slim margin, but ultimately the highest scoring debater in this match, is in fact the third speaker from Hillview College, the reply speaker. Congratulations to you, the third speaker from Hillview. My apologies. Sorry, I'm so sorry. It is in fact the first speaker from Hillview College. Of course, commendations and commendable speaker. The second best debater was the third speaker from Hillview College. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sitting and engaging and imbibing in this fantastic conversation. But it's not just a conversation for fun and enjoyment. It's a conversation that's designed to mobilize, to inform, and to agitate us as Caribbean people towards the end of reparations. See you next time when we reconvene for the next match, which comes up in a few minutes from now.